reading session of Guru Maharaj's Ocean of Mercy. We we are aware how Guru Maharaj is hospitalized, and we all having anxious moments on about his health, about his situation, and many of us are chanting extra rounds, chanting Narsingh Kavach. Mm. So I thought it may be a good idea. Some of us thought to read Ocean of Mercy together and absorbed in pastimes of Srila Prabhupada and Srila Gurudev. So we'll start our evening session now. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Charo Swami Dinamane Snigdha Cheta Supraneta Vakalam Chara Savatam Prabhupada Pranam Ram Chara Hare Krishna. So, heartiest welcome to all of you, and we'll read Ocean of Mercy. We'll be reading from chapter 1. I hope everybody has a chapter Ocean of Mercy with you. Can you raise hand those who do not have Ocean of Mercy with them? Okay. So, okay. So there's a couple of devotees who don't have. So my request will be, please hear attentively, and maybe for next sessions we will arrange. Okay, Gaurav Prabhu. So we'll arrange some extra copies. You can contact Ronnie Prabhu or Amit Prabhu and get the copies from them. We'll arrange the copies for tomorrow. So we can do screen share, but we'll see if we can read without screen because the font. Ronnie Prabhu, we can do the screen share only then? Only 2 or 3 devotees don't have.
We can do the screen sharing.
Okay. Hare Krishna. So we've done the screen share. I hope आप सब लोगों को you can all see. You can see Ronnie Prabhu?
It was visible before, now it is not.
Okay. Now you can see?
Yes.
Hare Krishna. So we'll start our reading session now of Ocean of Mercy. So this is chapter 1. We are reading from chapter 1. So I will just start reading, and I will also invite if anybody they want to share any pastime related to what we are reading. So then please you can raise your hand, and I will invite you to share your realizations of what we are reading. If anything connected with this, you had an incident you read or we personally had with Guru Maharaj, then please raise your hand and we'll invite you to share your thoughts with everyone. Hare Krishna. So we are starting. This is chapter 1, On the Road, 1945 to 1975. I was always drawn to spiritual life. As a child, I loved to sit with my mother on the roof at night, gazing up at the star-filled sky as she pointed out celestial planets and fascinated me with stories about their inhabitants, divine beings with incredible powers. I longed to go and meet them. A pious Hindu, my mother worshipped many gods and goddesses, but she taught me to have faith in Krishna and Ram, to depend on them and call out to them when I was afraid or sad or distressed. My father was educated, progressive, and westernized, with little spiritual interest. We had found success in the pioneering stages of the Indian film industry, and material prosperity was his main concern. We lived in an affluent neighborhood in Calcutta, and though motor cars were rare in those days, my father had two, one for local transport and a jeep for outdoor work, such as shooting on location. While his brothers took public transport and wore dhotis and kurtas, traditional Indian wear, he wore three-piece suits and was driven to work by a chauffeur. He was my hero, and I was proud of him, but most of his time was taken up by his career, about which he was passionate. He worked late, and I saw little of him. When I was 7, my mother contracted tuberculosis, and my family was separated to avoid contagion. My younger sister was sent to an aunt's house, and my older brother and I went to live with my father's elder sister. She was a widow whose 8 children were all grown up, and she showered us with love and affection. She was also an excellent vegetarian cook who loved to serve others, and I developed a liking for her dishes. But I missed my mother. I knew she was sick, but I didn't understand why we could not be together. One day, during a birthday party for a cousin, I sneaked out to see her. When I looked into her room, she was sitting up in bed, propped up by pillows, with her eyes closed. I stood at the doorway, not sure whether to approach her. But when she opened her eyes, I could see her look of happy surprise, and she beckoned to me to come closer. She thought someone had brought me, but when I told her that I had snuck away and come by myself, she hugged me and started to cry. I laid my head on her lap and she caressed me, tears coursing down her cheeks. Then she drew me in and held me in a tight embrace, comforting me with the warm beating of her heart. A few days later, one of my uncles came to fetch my brother and me from my aunt's. I thought we might be going to see our mother, but when we went to put on our shoes, our uncle told us not to. I could tell that something was wrong. I didn't know what had happened, but my brother broke down crying. I understood that family members were not supposed to touch any inauspicious objects, including leather, when someone had died. We arrived at the house to find several relatives gathered, all looking grave. Upstairs, our mother was laid out on her bed, her eyes closed, flower garlands around her neck, and colorful bouquet surrounding her body. Her face was decorated with sandalwood paste, and a bright red sindoor dot marked the center of her brow. She looked so beautiful, I thought so peaceful, as if she was sleeping. At some point, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder and was ushered out of the room. As I entered the living room, I heard some of my relatives start to cry, but I couldn't look at anyone. I just stood at the window, staring out at the next door garden. That's when it all came to me. Tears streamed from my eyes, and I broke down, sobbing. I would never see my mother again. My mother's passing affected all the circumstances of my life. My father lost interest in everything, even us, and stopped doing anything to earn money or maintain the household. He became depressed, feeling that he was responsible for my mother's illness and death, having neglected her in favor of his career. Even my aunt's house was no longer the same. She and our cousins were as affectionate as ever, but it just felt different. It was not my home. I felt I did not belong. I had always been an excellent student and received praise for my intelligence. So the plan had been to send me to one of the best boarding schools in India, in the foothills of Himalayas. But my father's financial downturn, that was no longer possible, and I was enrolled instead in the local day school. It was so common, I thought, so ordinary. I wanted to attend the private school where the student dressed in nice uniforms and studied everything in English, taught by teachers from England. I became obsessed with the idea. I wanted to learn English and be like an Englishman, like my father had been before my mother's passing. I just couldn't generate any enthusiasm for my school or interest in my studies. As had been true at my aunt's house, I felt that it was the wrong place for me, that I didn't belong, and as a result, I failed my annual exams and I didn't get promoted to the next grade. The day I found out, I sat alone in my classroom crying. I couldn't go home. I was too embarrassed. When I left school, I wandered aimlessly, eventually finding myself on the bank of Ganga, considering what to do. Then I noticed the railroad station on the other side of the river. That's it, I thought. I would take the train to the boarding school in the foothills, promise the principal that I would be good, and beg him to let me stay. Inspired, I ran back to my aunt's. It was still afternoon, so the house was quiet, and I sneaked in through the back door, grabbed some things, emptied my piggy bank, and found more money in my cousin's drawer. Then I slipped out and dashed to the station. Seeing a young boy alone, the ticketing clerk was suspicious. But I told him that I was returning to school. When he asked why no one was with me, I said my mother had died and my father had meant to come with me, but had been called away by some unforeseen business. I was used to traveling alone, I told him. I could manage on my own. So he gave me a ticket and let me pass. I used the same story on my co-passengers, and an hour later, I was heading north in search of the boarding school of my dreams. That night, still on the train, after having fallen asleep, I was gently awakened by someone shaking my arm. When I looked up, I saw that the train had stopped at a junction, and I was surrounded by a group of passengers, accompanied by a police officer. This time, when asked who I was and where I was going, I didn't dare lie. When the officer heard my story, he took me to the local station and phoned my father. I didn't want to talk to him, but when the father insisted, I took the phone and then broke down crying. After the officer explained the situation to my father, he took me to his home nearby, where his wife fed me and put me to sleep. I stayed the next day as well, almost entirely in bed. They were very nice to me, but alone in the room, I felt like a criminal who had been arrested. That night, my father came to take me back to Calcutta. There he sat with me, and we had the longest talk I could remember having with him. He told me how much he loved me and how much confidence he had in me. No matter what I had done, he said, he knew I was a good boy and would never do anything really bad. My mother had loved me, he assured me. She still did. Then he silently, then he sat silently as I cried out of agony of separation. The next few days, I just stayed in my room, unsure what would come next. My aunt was still loving and supportive, but things had changed, and everyone around me realized that something had to be done. It was decided that I would be sent to an uncle in the small town of Kovai in Tripura, about 500 kilometers east, across the border in Bangladesh. Kovai was a quiet little town on the bank of a river, surrounded by mountains. People knew each other and seemed to lead a simple, happy life. Unlike his brothers, my uncle had chosen business over education, and he had become quite successful supplying jute to the mills in Calcutta. Everyone in the town treated him with affectionate respect. Initially, I felt that I was being sent to Kovai as punishment for my crime of running away. but my experiences soon relieved me of such misgivings. I had come from the big city, and the local people treated me with some admiration. More importantly, my uncle and aunt accepted me as if I were their son, and I was like a big brother to their three small children. My aunt even told me that when, for a long time, she, she had not been able to have a child, she had requested my mother to give me to her. And now the Lord has fulfilled her desire. So I began to settle into life in Kauai. So this is one part. And if anybody wants to read also, you can raise your hand and we can read together, all of us, turn by turn. So those who would like to read, please raise your hand and I will request them they can read. I will do the screen sharing. I will switch on the screen sharing. Okay. Yes, Neha Kumra Mataji. So you start first. I will do the screen share again. Yes, Mataji. Neha Mataji?
So I have unmuted her.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Yes, Hare Krishna. You can read Mataji.
Yes, so I should read for one paragraph.
I will tell you when to stop, Mataji. You go ahead.
Okay, so this starts from my relationship with my father.
Yes, Mataji.
Okay, Hare Krishna Prabhuji. My relationship with my father had been quite distant since my mother's passing, but since my running off, we had become closer, and I began to feel his love for me again. He wrote to me with life instructions and expressed his love and confidence that I would succeed. He reminded me that my mother was always watching over me and that she would feel proud when I had made something of myself. Things went well in Kauai, and I was back on track, making friends and doing well in school. I was not very big or strong, but I enjoyed some success with athletics. I was the goalkeeper for the school soccer team and did quite well in cricket, which I loved. In my final year at 16, I was the only student selected for the subdivision cricket team, which uh, other than myself was comprised of older players, mostly government officers. Our team played well and we even reached the finals of the inter-district tournament. Early in the final game, we were being outplayed and defeat seemed certain. But then I scored a half century, 50 runs in one inning, and won the game for my team. I was the star, and the sub-divisional officer honored me in the victory celebration at the town hall. My strongest subject was English. Most educated Indians, or at least most of those I knew, believed the saying, West is the best. Although Britain's rule of India had ended in 1947, 2 years after my birth, its culture was still prevalent. As one of my teachers told us, if you want to learn English, you have to read in English, write in English, speak in English, think in English, even dream in English. And I worked diligently to follow his instructions. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. So we can, anybody wants to share also something about Guru Maharaj can also share. You can raise your hand and I will will unmute you for here. But we can see Guru Maharaj liking for the English language. And even today, we see how perfect Guru Maharaj's diction is. His diction is perfect in English, perfect in Sanskrit, and perfect in Hindi also. And it is those of us who have heard him singing Bhaktivinoda Thakur's poem in English, that he sings poem also so wonderfully. So we can see how that upbringing in the initial years, molded, and he had so many gifts from the birth itself. So now I will ask other devotees who are seeking permission. Okay. Yes. So Mohini Gopika Mataji, you can start. I will do the screen share.
Yes, Hare Krishna Prabhuji. My favorite instructor is this Prabhuji?
Yes, Mataji.
My favorite instructor, Neerad Babu, had been a freedom fighter in India's struggle for independence. He had been imprisoned and brutally tortured by the British. I was told that they had damaged a vein supplying blood to his brain. And that was a result that he had lost his mental stamina. He would often become exhausted and sit in pain, holding his head in his hands. But when he was able to teach, he was brilliant. It was such a contrast. He had been a freedom fighter and hated the British, but he loved their language. I loved literature and was fascinated by the authors, wordplay, and stories. In addition to works by English authors, we also read English translations of work by such famous authors as Homer, Tolstoy, and Dumas. Their influence on me was so strong that although I appreciated Indian authors, I naively presumed their writings had been influenced by the Western predecessor and counterparts. Those books by great Western authors ignited the urge in me to see that world and become a part of it. Wisdom I felt came not from sitting in a classroom or reading books, but from going places and meeting people. I had to go out and see the world. I could con- I could have continued my studies in Tripura, but I decided to attend a college in Darjeeling, a beautiful hill station that the British had built as their summer residence. One of my uncles was a successful lawyer there, and when I expressed my desire to study there, he happily made the arrangements. My plan was to become a scientist, so I registered for an honors degree in chemistry. But after 2 years, I was selected for a scholarship to train as a pilot with the possibility of enlisting in the Indian Air Force, and I opted for that instead. Back in Calcutta for flight training, I met a group of boys I had helped in Darjeeling. They had come from Calcutta for summer vacation without making prior arrangements. And when they had arrived in Darjeeling, they had found that all the hostels were fully booked and there was no available accommodation. One of them, Tulsi Sen, had once met my cousin and had her phone number as his only contact in Darjeeling. In desperation, he had phoned her and described their situation. He had not known what to do and passed the phone to me. And after making a few phone calls, I had managed to arrange for them to stay in the guest house of the local indoor stadium, which usually accommodated visiting players. Tulasi and two of the other boys, Swapna Thakur and Gaura Ghosh, had been especially grateful, and we have become good friends. Now the boys wanted to reciprocate, and they introduced me to their other friends and related how much I helped them in Darjeeling. They were all from a very affluent families. Tulsi's father was an eminent lawyer in the Calcutta High Court. Swapna Thakur was related to the famous poet Rabindranath Tagore, and Gaura came from a family of successful industrialists. They had all been educated in the kind of school I had dreamed of attending. Tulsi introduced me to Anand Mohan, the son of chairman of the Indian Service Commission, and we three became close and spent most of our spare time together. After my flight training, Haribol.
Thank you, Mataji. So we just want to rotate so everybody gets a chance, but we still see
Sure.
how multi-talented Guru Maharaj was from that day one, and small anecdotes also. Guru Maharaj so vividly remembers her when we read about Guru Maharaj speaking about his mother, and that whole emotions which he would have gone as a child. It is very surprising, that he remembers them so vividly. He could describe. So now we will go to the next. Is Rachna Mataji?
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
From where? Which paragraph, Prabhuji?
This one, Mataji. After my flight training.
After my flight training, I was told that I was not good enough to join the Air Force, and I did not have the finances to get a commercial lots license. So I decided to earn some money and travel abroad. he had always dreamt of doing, I teamed up with a friend, Aloka Gupta, and together we started a business promoting instant coffee. When we had earned enough, he left to study in England. But although most of my friends dreamt of going there, and I had my eyes set on Germany, specifically Hamburg, where I had a cousin who had encouraged me to come and pursue my studies. My choice of Germany was also inspired by a lifelong connection of my father's close friend, Vijayapati Ghosh, whom we called Vidya, Vidya Kaku, uncle. Vijayapati had studied in Berlin and come back with a German wife, our Dolly Kakima, Aunt Dolly. She had a Jewish background, and when the persecution of Jews had begun in Germany in the 1930s, they had escaped on bicycles, riding more than 400 miles on the Swiss border, to the Swiss border. When they settled in Calcutta, Dolly Kakima became absorbed in the local Bengali culture. She had been very close with my mother and had always treated me with affection, especially after my mother's passing. So when I heard that another of my friends, person, was going to Germany to study social psychology, I decided to join him. Many young people from Europe and America were traveling in East in search of spiritual life, but I, like many other Indians, including my father, was attracted by the allure of material prosperity, and so I wanted to visit new places and broaden my views. Thus, in the summer of 1970, I headed west in the opposite direction.
Thank you so much, Rachna Mataji. So,
Thank you, Prabhuji.
yes, Ved Singh Prabhu, you can start. I will do the screen share.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Shall I start from like many of our friends?
Yes, Prabhu.
Like many of our friends, Prasun and I had read and been influenced by Jack Kerouac's On the Road. So we had the idea that instead of flying to Europe, we would travel the roads hitchhiking. It would be a challenge, we knew, especially since Pakistan was off limits to Indians. But Prasun suggested that we take a ship to Basra, Iraq, and proceed overland from there. So we took a train to Bombay, spent a few days getting visas for countries along the way: Iraq, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and Switzerland. All required them, and embarked one morning on a cargo ship from Balad Pier. After a week of stopping at what seemed like every port in the Persian Gulf, we were thrilled to land in Basra and get our feet back on solid land. I had never ventured outside India, and I was enchanted, filled with images from my reading about the Assyrian and Babylonian civilizations on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, and the hanging gardens built by King Nebu, Nebu, Nebuchadnezzar. Sorry, I could not pronounce that. To soothe the afflicted heart of his homesick queen. We had heard that there was a Sikh temple in Basra where we could stay for free, and some young local boys showed us the way. We immediately became friends with them, and they said they would pick us up the next morning and show us around the city. We had not planned to stop for long, but we had such a good time with our new companions, seeing their college, meeting their friends, and visiting the mosque, the old Latin church, and the Indian market, that we decided to stay a few more days. In the evenings, we all sat around talking and drinking tea in the open air cafes known as casinos, though there were no gambling, on the banks of Shat al Arab River. 3 days later, Prasun and I took a bus to the highway on which we would hitchhike to Baghdad. No one would stop, though, and it was extremely hot. So after several hours, dejected over the failure of our attempt to hitchhike across the continent, but also relieved to be out of the scorching sun, we got on a bus. An American traveler in the Basra had told us about a French church in Baghdad where one could stay for free. And when we found it, a beautiful cathedral in the middle of the city, we received a warm welcome from a middle-aged French priest. In Baghdad, as in Basra, Prasun and I made friends quickly. We connected with a group of affluent university students who showed us the city and hosted us at restaurants, responding to our expression of gratitude by saying, "No thanks for duty." They were fun-loving but strict Muslims, so they did not drink or smoke, and we visited them in their homes practically every day, sipping tea from small, fine, fine gilded glasses in their large villas and beautiful gardens. One of their mothers washed and pressed our clothes for us, and when we got them back, I found that one of my socks in which I had worn a hole had been perfectly mended. Haribol.
Thank you so much. So many times whenever I read, I'm mesmerized how much Guru Maharaj remembers, from the past life, so-called material life. If you ask me, I don't wish to remember anything, but it is wonderful how the small, that he would even remembers that somebody mended his sock. You can imagine that guests they entertained or they helped turned into a pure devotee. You can understand how many souls would be getting benefit from such association. Thank you so much, Vivek Prabhu. Okay, nice. We have Preeti Mataji. Go ahead. I will start the screen share.
I have the book. Even with our friends' warm hospitality, however, I was determined to resume our journey. I tried to convince Prasun to come along, but he was adamant on staying back. He seemed to want to be on his own, free from any association and influence. He had left India to experience the world, he said, and wanted to take full advantage of the opportunity to spend time with our new friends. He was enjoying himself and he wanted to stay on, so we agreed to part ways. I would leave the following morning. Mark, an English traveler, Prasun and I had met in the church, had witnessed our conversation and asked if he could join me. We had already developed an amiable relationship, so I agreed. When one of our Arab friends, Ahmed, heard that we were heading north toward the Turkish border, he suggested that we visit his family in Zakho in Kurdistan. So that was our first destination. Having found hitchhiking in Iraq practically impossible, I suggested that we travel by bus. Ahmed had alerted his friends that we would be coming, so when we arrived, we were greeted by a warm reception and brought right to his house. His father, an old man with a long flowing beard, greeted us with a broad smile. He didn't speak any English, but Ahmed's sister was fluent, and both she and his friends took great care of us. Zakho was a small town with little to see, but we were drawn in by its ruins, which bore signs of a rich history and culture. Few of Ahmed's friends spoke English, but we developed a simple bond of friendship with gestures and smiles. We played soccer together and afterwards would cool ourselves in the shallow waters of the local river. Orchards of apples, pears, and figs grew on its banks, and we would sit beneath the trees and enjoy it. When after 3 days the time came for Mark and me to move on, many of our Zakho acquaintances came to their doors to bid us farewell. After my experience in Basra, I was not optimistic about hitchhiking, but this time Mark insisted. Several of the boys walked with us to the highway, and as we tried to hitch a ride, they stood nearby watching. As hour after hour passed without success, I gave whatever little hope I had. Finally, one of the boys got an idea, and the next thing I knew, a few of them had stopped a passing truck, spoken with the driver, and were waving at us. Somehow, they had convinced him to take us to the Turkish border. As the truck pulled out, Mark and I looked back gratefully at our friends waving from the side of the road. The driver spoke a few words of English, just enough for us to carry on a friendly conversation. He was going into Turkey, to Diyarbakir, he said, and would take us there. When we reached the outskirts of the city, Mark suggested that we not enter but stay on the road. It was already quite late, so we decided to spend the night on the roadside. I had never slept out in the open, but it was a wonderful feeling to rest on the bare ground under the star-studded sky.
Thank
Want
you.
me to stop?
No, thank you. Thank you so much. So now, and anyone also can, if they want to share anything which comes to their heart regarding Guru Maharaj, can also share with us. So yes, next is Anita Sharma Mataji. So I will start the screen share.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Our plan was to stop in Malta on our way to Ankara. There was two possible routes on the map. One looked longer, the other shorter and straight. So we decided to take the shorter one. Only after riding some distance did we realize that we had embarked on a mountainous road. But by then it was too late to turn back. Our ride took us up into the mountains and dropped us off at what seemed like the middle of nowhere. We waited under a walnut tree on the side of the road for hours without anyone stopping. In fact, hardly anyone even passed, and we doubted that any of the drivers knew about hitchhiking. Still, I was excited to see the interior of Turkey, and the place was enchanting. The mountains were cut from red rock with only sparse vegetation. A river flowed along the valley below, with banks of lush green. Clusters of village houses dotted the landscape. I suggested to Mark that we go down to the village and see if we could find I offered to stay. It would not be such a long way down to the village, but I did not know how would communicate with the people there. Why don't you go? He said with a smile. We finally decided to settle it by tossing a coin. I lost and had to go. I climbed down a winding path, but even in the village, there were no shops. I walked up to a house and knocked. A woman came to the door, but when she saw me, she screamed and slammed the door in my face, giving up hope of finding food. I climbed back up the mountain to the road and told Mark what had happened. We sat for a few more hours under the walnut tree, shedding ourselves from the sun, our stomachs burning with hunger. We discussed our mistake in taking the mountain road and considered going back to the other route. Suddenly, several boys came into view. They silently approached us with two large covered metal plates and placed them before us. When we removed the coverings, we found homemade Turkish bread, raw green vegetables, and large pieces of goat cheese. We thanked the boys profusely and then ate while they sat around us, watching and speaking among themselves in a language we couldn't understand. After a short while, several village women came up and sat behind the boys to watch. One of them was from Lebanon and asked whether we knew French. Mark was fluent, and we learned from her that when the woman who had shut the door on me had seen that I was climbing back up to the road, she had called to the other women and told them what had happened. They presumed that I had been looking for food and spotting the two of us. They had sent the boys with the plate. The other residents, the woman said, had hardly seen a foreigner in their entire lives. So the arrival of an Englishman and an Indian was quite an event. The women's hospitality was wonderful, but we still could not get a ride, and we stood by the road the rest of the day. Finally, toward evening, an elderly shepherd tending his flock spoke to us. From his gestures, we made out that he was inviting us to spend the night in his home. We happily accepted. He was a simple, poor shepherd, yet he offered us what he could, food and a place to sleep. In the morning, Mark and I decided to make our way back down the mountain to a more populous place where we had a better chance of being picked up. Once we were back on the main road, hitchhiking in Turkey was not as difficult as it had been in Iraq. And we soon got stories of short rides. Near Ankara, we were picked up by 3 English boys from York University in an old station wagon. And we rode with them through the entire stretch of Turkey and into Istanbul, where Asia and Europe meet.
Thank you, Mataji. Yes, next is Lavanmai Radhika Mataji. You can please read. I'll switch on the screen share.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Mataji.
Okay. Should I go ahead, Prabhu?
Yeah, yes, Mataji.
Okay. So it's from every morning or Istanbul?
Istanbul.
Okay. Can you make the screen a little bigger, Prabhu?
Sure, Mataji. Once.
Thank you so much.
You can expand on your phone also, Mataji.
Yeah, I saw that. Yes, that's what I was thinking. Sometimes your brain doesn't work. I'm sorry about it.
No problem.
Istanbul Sultanahmet district near the Blue Mosque didn't look like Turkey. It was full of young Americans and Europeans. Their alternative hippie lifestyles were new to me, but most were quiet, broad-minded, and friendly. The dormitory style hotel was so cheap that we would afford to stay for a while, and we made many friends, including a young American, Larry Baker. Every morning, Mark, Larry, and I would go for the breakfast at Pudding Shop, a restaurant popular among young travelers, where we spent a good deal of our time. The food was delicious and cheap, but the most interesting feature for me was the atmosphere. It was alive with free-thinking youth who were open to meeting people and sharing their experience. Some of them had been in Istanbul for months, living day to day, playing music and just hanging out. We roamed the city, visited historic sites, and just sat and chatted on the banks of the river. One morning, Mark suggested that we go see Topkapi Palace, an hour away. I was struck by the name because Top means cannon in Bengali and was including in many Bengali words and names. It was, I realized later, a Turkish word that had been incorporated into Bengali during the Persian invasion of India. Mark took the whole role of tour guide. The palace, which was actually an enormous cluster of buildings and courtyards, had been the seat of the Ottoman dynasty that had ruled over Asia Minor and significantly part of Europe for centuries. We spent the day there admiring the classic architecture and ornate decorations and amazed by the sheer magnitude of the place. Mark and I stayed in Istanbul for a full week. The day before we were going to leave, we were sitting in a park with Larry when 2 young men approached us and asked if we would like to smoke some hashish. Neither Mark nor I were interested, but Larry left with the man. He didn't come back that night, and the next morning, worried, we told the manager of the pudding shop we were concerned that the men could have been police in plain clothes and that Larry might have been arrested. The manager told us not to worry. If anything, the police would frame Larry to get a bribe. Drugs were not a big deal in Turkey unless you were caught smuggling large quantities. Larry didn't return that morning, but reassured by the manager, we posted 2 notes on the pudding shop's notice board, one for Larry and one for Prashun, and then left for Greece. Like many Indian boys, I had been enchanted by Alexander the Great. My brother had told me the story of Alexander and the massive legendary horse Bucephalus. No one had been able to name Bucephalus, but Alexander spoke to it soothingly and turned its head towards the sun so it could not see its shadow, which had been the cause of its distress. With Bucephalus thus subdued, Alexander was able to ride it, and the horse served as his mount until it died during his invention of India. I also loved hearing about Alexander's encounter with the Persian king Darius. Darius had a huge army, 5 times larger than Alexander's. So when he had been challenged by Alexander, whom Darius considered a mere boy, he was so confident of victory that he bought his wife and mother. But Alexander attacked him unexpectedly at a mountain pass away from the battlefield. Darius ran away, leaving behind his wife and mother, who were taken into custody. When he then offered a huge ransom in exchange for their freedom, Alexander replied that he was not interested in the ransom, but would release the woman if Darius appeared before him and knelt in submission. Darius did as ordered, and Alexander set the woman free. Once when Alexander was away from his kingdom, his minister wrote to him that his mother was meddling in affairs of state. Alexander wrote back, "One teardrop from my mother's eye can wipe out all your letter complaining against her." Mark and I were headed to Thessaloniki, Macedonia's capital, near Alexander's birthplace in Pella. One of our rides was from an educated French couple who spoke fluent English. One of 3 families traveling together in 3 cars. They stopped at a beach in Alexandropolis, where we all had an ocean swim and a picnic. They were the first European families I had met on the road. All the Westerners in Istanbul had been young travelers, and I found them pleasant and friendly. I was impressed by the cultured and the generous attitude of the couple who picked us up, and I wondered how often I would get rides from such people. Would you have picked me up if I had been hitchhiking alone? Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Thank you
Jai
so
Shila
much.
Gurudev.
Yes. Next is Shivani Mataji.
Then paused. Then the man looked at his wife and smiled, and she said that they generally did not pick up hitchhikers at all, but that seeing me an Indian, they had been curious. In Thessaloniki, Mark and I stopped in a youth hostel. But to stay there, I needed a membership card, and to get one, I had to prove that I was a student. Mark and I tried to reason with the manager that no one carried a certificate while traveling, but the man was adamant. Finally, having overheard the conversation, a few young Americans sitting in the nearby lounge came up to the counter and practically shouted at the manager on my behalf, and he succumbed to the pressure. From there, we hitchhiked during the days and stayed in the youth hostel at night, passing through the Yugoslavia and into Italy, where we spent a few days in Venice and Milan, and then stop in Turin. At that point, Mark was supposed to head back to England and I would continue into Germany. But he changed his mind and decided to visit a friend in Dijon, France. I was already feeling sad at the thought of us parting ways. So when Mark proposed that I accompany him, I agreed. And thanks to his pleadings at the border, I was able to get an emergency 3-day visa. Mark's friend Pierre was in Dijon studying at the university and he hosted us in his apartment, which he shared with the female roommate. Their arrangement was unusual. I thought even a bit shocking. I had not seen anything like it before. It was also my first experience of an European university. Although we had found that the people in France generally did not like to speak English, the students were quite different. Their English was not fluent, but they seemed to take an amused delight in conversing with us. From France, we went to Switzerland, and in Basel, Mark, I finally had to part. We sat in a meadow near the border, reminiscing over our days together and making plans to meet again. We embraced, our cheeks pressed tight, and then he stood watching as I crossed the border into Germany, turned and waved goodbye. Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Mataji. Yes. This Guru Maharaj getting shocked at seeing a college student staying with a female. And I remember how in one of the lectures, Prabhupada, he said that what you call girlfriend in your country, we call prostitute in India. That was Prabhupada's comment. So, okay. There was a hand from iPhone 8. That hand is down. Okay. Anybody else would like to read? Please raise your hand if anybody else would like to read. Okay. So, yes, Parul Mataji, I will do the screen share. And then Shyam Sundari Mataji. Okay. Thank you. So I think that will be the last ones. So I will start.
My cousin Babida, his name was Babi, and Da was short for Dada, the Bengali term for one's elder brother, had been living in Germany for over a decade. He had studied engineering there and risen to become a director for a prosperous farm. His marriage to a German woman, Maria, had strained his relationship with his conservative family in India, but I found her to be very nice. I was reminded of my Dali Kakima, who had also married an Indian man. When I told Maria that I would call her Muradi, the D being short for Didi, an elder sister, she gave me a big smile. We became close in no time and she accepted me as part of the family. She took me to the University of Hamburg to get me admitted. And when we learned that the semester had already began, she convinced them to enroll me as a guest student. One of the first people I befriended in Hamburg was Bill McCabe, an American exchange student from the University of Dayton. In India, I had been a member of the United States Information Service, which had a good library and promoted various aspects of American culture. One of its features was a jazz club, and every Saturday afternoon, my friends and I would listen to swing and bebop and challenge each other to identify each musician. America House, where I met Bill, was the German counterpart, beautifully located in the middle of a large garden near the university. I went there frequently, mostly to read in the library, and one day Bill just walked up to me and introduced himself. He was interested in India. He said many of his friends had already been there and wondered where I was from. Bill introduced me to his group of friends, Chuck, Ray, Jack, Connie, and Susan, all Dayton students. My German was still not very strong, so I did not develop such close relationships with many local students, but my friendship with this group developed quite spontaneously. After staying with Babida and Miradi for a couple of months, I decided to move out on my own. The family with whom Bill was staying had another student staying with them. When she moved out, Bill asked whether I or one of his friends could move in. The landlady agreed, but when she learned that I was Indian, she expressed some reservations. The next day, Bill had to go to Kiel, a city on the North Sea, and he didn't tell his landlady that he was going. After he had been away for 2 days, she thought that he was so upset with her because of her refusal that he was not returning. So when he got back, she said, "Yes, of course your Indian friend can stay, come and stay." From then on, Bill and I lived in the same house, and our bond of friendship became deeper. On Saturdays, I would cook Indian food, which he loved. After hearing his rave reviews, all of our friends wanted invitations, but not wanting to abuse the family's hospitality, I invited them only 1 or 2 at a time. Still, the house was a nice alternative to our usual meeting place, a discotheque called the Madhouse. One Sunday during the summer, when the whole group was sitting together in a restaurant near the harbor, Chuck asked me in a rather condescending tone how many people died of starvation in India each year. His disrespect was insulting, but I tried to control my anger. Many people in the West had that misconception, but no one had ever put it so bluntly. Although I was born and brought up in India, I said, I never seen anyone die of starvation. Oh, come on, he persisted. Everyone knows that. You don't have to defend your country's honor. After all, a fact is a fact. A reality is a reality. India is not poor, I protested. She may not be so advanced or affluent materially, but she is not poor. If she were, why would Columbus have ventured so far to find her? Why was she so considered the crown of jewel of the British Empire? You may claim whatever you want, he argued, but everybody knows India's poverty-stricken condition. India is not interested in material prosperity, I countered, but in developing her spiritual riches. Because material wealth was not her first priority, foreign invaders found little resistance and stole all they could. What are your so-called spiritual riches? That the real goal of life is to achieve emancipation, elevation to a higher consciousness. By smoking pot? No, by performing austerities, negating the demands of the body. That's just the excuse of a useless bums. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Mataji. We do just have the last participant. Sham Sundari Radhika Mataji, you please, I will start the screen share. You can continue.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranam.
Dandavat Pranam.
When the others saw that the argument was spiraling out of control, they suggested we stop, but the encounter had left me wounded. Despite my protest, I was painfully aware of how ignorant I was about the heritage and glory of the place of my birth. My patriotism, I realized, was only a sentimental attachment. Although I had a deep connection to India as my motherland, I was unaware of her actual splendor and opulence. That argument and my desire to establish India's greatness led me to probe deeper into my country's spiritual culture. I already knew the importance of spiritual life and was aware of the existence of the soul, but now I felt compelled to learn about life's actual nature, purpose, and ultimate goal. I wrote to my friend Hitu Malkani, whose family had a bookstore in Calcutta, and he sent me a copy of Paul Brunton's A Search in Secret India. At first, I was vexed by having to read about India's glory from an Englishman, but the more I read, the more I appreciated. Brunton was a journalist who had gone to India on assignment, and while there had been drawn in by its spiritual heritage. He had met many sadhus and finally surrendered himself in discipleship to a well-known spiritual leader from South India, Ramana Maharshi. When I asked Malkani for books that described India's spiritual philosophies in great depth, he sent me a few by Swami Vivekanand, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Paramhamsa Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi, Dr. Radhakrishnan's Bhagavad Gita, and a copy of Vedanta Sutra. Over the next few years, I learned more about the real source of India's greatness, but in the process, I also became aware of a higher knowledge, the futility of material existence, and the need to become free from its bondage. Why struggle to achieve something that will be lost at the time of death? I wondered. Better to strive for something that would lead to liberation and last forever. And as my interest in and understanding of this wisdom from India grew, my fascination with the West began to wane. What had been my life there receded like a memory fading into a dim and distant past. I had always had the feeling that one day I would leave everything behind and become a sadhu. I had thought it was just a fantasy. Probably everyone felt that way at some point, but no one I knew had gone ahead and surrendered entirely to spiritual life. But during my travels, I had experienced the pleasure of freedom, of just being present in the world, floating with time and appreciating whatever came. I felt I felt satisfaction in simple achievements and relished meeting people who were open and receptive, being invited to their homes and sharing our thoughts and feelings as if we had known each other for years. Often not getting a ride until night time, I would lie down in my sleeping bag by the side of the road and take rest under the stars. The following morning, I would greet the new day with joyful anticipation, not even knowing what lay in store. I began to realize that this was what had wanted to do since childhood, venturing out on my own, seeing new places, meeting new people. In this way, my fantasy could become a reality, and I decided to see it through. Winston Churchill had urged young men aged 20 to 25 to go out into the world and do things, to make mistakes and learn. His statement had made a deep impression on me, and I regretted only that when I read it at the age of 23, I was already 3 years behind. From my other readings, I understood that to take to spiritual life, I had to surrender myself to a guru, and I was convinced that I would find one in India.
Thank you so much, Mataji. So I hope this reading session was fruitful and we could attach ourselves to the lotus feet of Guru Maharaj. And I'm very thankful to all of you who came and gave us their association. So Krishna willing, we'll try to keep it a regular event of reading Ocean of Mercy. And before we close, if anybody want to share anything which touched their heart while reading this initial journey of Guru Maharaj, then we can have someone maybe for 1 or 2 minutes can speak something, whatever touched our heart. And there are some messages on the chat. So Mohini Gopika Mataji is saying, this conversation with friend gave a turning point to Guru Maharaj's life to dive back to Indian culture and spirituality. Yes, yes, Mataji. It's a turning point, that whole conversation Guru Maharaj had. And so would anybody like to share anything which touched their heart? There is a hand raised, iPhone 8 Plus. I don't see the name. Would you like to share something?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna, Mataji.
I wanted to continue reading actually with the book.
I'm sorry, Mataji, we ran short of time.
Oh,
But Krishna
okay.
willing, tomorrow we'll start, and tomorrow you can begin, Mataji.
And what is the timing? The same time?
Mataji, we will announce, because it is just today was a trial session, so we'll announce.
Okay, okay, Prabhuji, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mataji. So, dear devotees, so we will end this session now. And like I was speaking to Mataji, we will announce the next reading session. We feel very encouraged by all of you coming together and reading Ocean of Mercy. So Krishna willing, we'll have a session tomorrow and we will shortly announce the time. So we'll end the session now. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Devagaravani Pracharini Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschat Deshatari Jagat Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai Srila Gurudeva Ki Jai Hare Krishna.